First, I'd like to recognize Margaret Spellings for her leadership and my fellow board member and former chairman of the board, former HUD Secretary Henry Cisneros. And I'd also like to recognize Dennis for your leadership. This is tremendous. And Ron, we miss you. Excuse me, I understand you're watching us and you'll be with us all day. It's truly been a joy to work alongside. I've been working with Ron. It brings tears to my eyes. Out of my 40-year career, I've spent 19 working alongside Ron Terwilliger. So thank you, Ron, for your leadership, and thank you for making all this possible. Okay, we get started. First, I'd like to welcome our speakers this morning. We have two tremendously well-educated housers, and it is certainly a great day to be a houser, isn't it? First, I'd like to welcome Mischa Fisher. He's the chief economist with Zillow. And Jenny Schuetz, she's the chief economist with Arnold Ventures, the head of infrastructure and housing. And their full bios are available to you. So I'd like to start off first with Mischa to talk a little bit about how we got here, the supply issues.
So just first off, echoing the importance of this as a subject matter. I mean, it really is so key to get this right. So thanks again to BPC for organizing it, setting up the forum, and congratulations to everybody on the Hill for getting this milestone through. So the housing supply shortage is something that has gotten worse because of the pandemic, but it's not a function of the pandemic. If you can hold that concept in your mind. What happened was before the pandemic, we'd already been underbuilding, and some of that was a function of the housing crash in 2007. So when that happened, a lot of home builders exited the market because it was such a shock to the system. And then that was a cumulative shortage that developed over the intervening 12-ish years, where we were still underbuilding relative to all of the households that were forming. And when the pandemic happened and interest rates dropped and remote work opened up and people went out there to start forming new households, that interacted with over a decade of underbuilding and made it much worse. So right now, our estimate is we're shy just about 5 million homes in terms of the missing supply. So that's just to catch up to sort of roughly where we need to be to match current demand. And one of the reasons why you sort of see different estimates is you've got to remember that measuring a person is very straightforward, and measuring a housing unit is pretty straightforward. All right, it's a couple of walls and a door. But saying how many households should live in that housing unit is more open to interpretation because people adjust their behavior. You heard from the senator saying, they had to move between units and people were, doubled up potentially in different housing units. And that response that people have to a shortage is why it can sometimes be difficult to measure how big that shortage is. So what we do is we look specifically at houses that are filled with people who are not necessarily what we think would be a household, and instead would be, they're sort of forced to live together for economic reasons, not for family formation reasons. And so when you do that calculation, that's why you get to about the 5 million number, where we are right now. And, so there's still a ton to build and get to that stage of more supply and addressing that problem. And that's why I'm so excited about what, sailed through the Senate last night, and we'll make some progress.
Thank you, Mischa. And Jenny, your research points to the cost and complexity of building new homes as an obstacle to meeting demand. What policies have historically made it too expensive or too complicated to build new housing?
We can think of sort of three categories of policies that have made it hard to build enough housing, particularly in high demand places. One of those is just a limitation on the kinds of structures that can be built on a piece of land. So we have zoned more than 3/4 of the land in this country for single family detached homes exclusively, meaning everything else is illegal to build. And if you think about it, the single family detached house on a yard takes up the most amount of land and is the most expensive type of house. And we've also sort of run out of space space, right? A lot of the neighborhoods that were built out in the 40s, 50s, and 60s are occupied by all the housing that you're allowed to build there. And so you just literally can't add any more under the current laws. So these restrictions on structure types and density are one. Second is that we have made it sometimes complicated or expensive with the labor and materials and the structures themselves. So one good example is that most new housing requires off-street parking spaces. If you think about an apartment building, to get an off-street parking space, we're usually talking about a garage at the bottom, it can cost $50,000 per parking space, and that's before you build any of the houses. So we've made it really expensive to add just to the structure itself. And then third, the process of building new housing, of getting permission to build, has gotten longer and more complicated and more uncertain over the last several decades. And so time is money in real estate. If you spend 5 years, 7 years, 10 years getting permission to build, all of that costs extra to the developer and then has to be built onto the final housing unit. So we need to make it legal to build homes of more shapes and sizes, bring down the hard costs of construction, and make the process of development shorter, simpler, and more transparent.
Thank you, Jenny. Earlier this year, the Trump administration issued an executive order on removing regulatory barriers to affordable home construction. As called for in the order, HUD developed regulatory best practices for state and local governments, organizing recommendations around 3 categories: decreasing costs, unlocking additional land for development, and accelerating construction timelines. If you had to rank these 3 levers by potential impact on housing supply, how would you order them and why? And I'll start with Jenny, because that's a continuation.
I'm going to cheat a little bit and say that it depends on the part of the country that we're talking about. So in places where land is really expensive, opening up more land is going to make a big difference. In parts of the country where land is less expensive, but the hard costs are really high, then decreasing the hard costs will matter a lot. But I'll actually say that I think making the process shorter and simpler and more transparent is probably the biggest win, particularly in a time like now where interest rates are so high. And so again, that cost of borrowing money to do the development is very expensive right now. The length of time and the uncertainty also makes it really hard to time when new housing comes online in the real estate cycle. Probably most of you in this room know that housing is a cyclical business, and what happens when it takes you a long time to build is that builders start doing their projects, and by the time the housing comes online, they may have missed sort of the peak. And so shortening that cycle would make it a lot more feasible to time the new supply to demand coming online.
Thanks, Jenny. Mischa, how would you rank them?
Economists love to disagree, but I have no notes. I think that's the perfect answer. Amortizing the cost of building over a longer window where you're not actually having sold the unit, if you can shorten that, that's basically a free way to lower cost. Other forms of lowering costs are beneficial, and it's you can find ways to improve that. But if you're just pulling excess time out of that, it's sort of pure savings. So I think that's a really, really powerful lever.
Okay, thank you. Okay, on to another topic that gets less attention is the shortage of skilled workers. And I'm going to start with Mischa on this. If you can talk about how this impacts residential construction and what does Zillow's data say about this workforce gap?
So I started off by talking about what happened in 2007 when we slowed down home construction pretty considerably. And roughly the volume was about 75% reduction in new housing starts. That wasn't just that we stopped building houses, right? Home builders disappeared. Small level home builders in particular just evaporated. Those businesses went away. Their pipelines for training and recruiting people went away. And there was not a market that was producing houses. So we lost the upstream funnel of people entering that market to build them. So part of the problem is that we not only have a deficit of housing, we also have a deficit of people who can build houses and to know how to do it. And that's not going to change overnight, but there are reasons to be, I think, cautiously optimistic on that front. And that is that culturally, there is something changing among younger people where there's more interest in the trades. And I think a lot of people, especially anybody around education policy, has sort of seen this bring shop class back to high schools kind of mentality, which I think is good, but some of that's just spread organically on social media, and you do get more people entering the trades. But there's still a role for policymakers in terms of making sure that you've got an educational pipeline that supports it, making sure that you've got people fully aware of the benefits of working in these areas, and then making sure, there's room around, some states have looked at, say, licensing compacts to make sure that a labor force can move. If you're certified to do work in one area, you can go do work in another area, right? So there's a creative policy discussion around improving that. But the quick version is, we still have not got back to the level of residential construction workforce that we had 20 years ago. We are still below that level. That is not true on the commercial side. On the commercial side, we are now have more people working in that construction space than we've ever had. But in residential, we're still short of where we were 20 years ago, despite the fact that we've got this housing deficit. So we do still need to bring more people back. There is a wage premium for working in the trades. That's true. The problem is the size of that premium is not as big as it's been in the past. So there's also still some room for higher wages to attract more people and enter the space.
What impact do you think AI will have on this workforce, on this skilled workforce?
I mean, it's a great question. I think it's going to have the most impact on the production of more prefabricated building components. So you hear this quite a lot in the context of SIPs, which is an insulated panel, which you'll hear talk about. So rather than framing on site, you can frame off site in a factory with a CNC machine, throw the panel on a flatbed truck, ship it to the job site on a crane. You can put a structure up in one day. And so there's lots of room to improve there. I think some of the more intriguing areas are around permitting and compliance reform, to make that process faster and to make it clearer what is zoned in one area or what is required by code in certain areas, because code requirements change. So there's area there. And then also in terms of faster training for people. So I think that if you are in the construction space, there's a lot to know in terms of how you frame, how you wire, how you plumb. And the tools are definitely something that are getting into the hands of production level contractors who are using those tools to get faster answers on terms of how you construct something if it's a particularly unconventional process. So that's a long-winded way, an economist way of saying it'll speed things up a little bit.
Okay, thank you, Mischa. Jenny, can you talk as an economist a little bit about how the housing shortage is affecting our national economy?
Yeah, there's such enormous spillovers from the housing market, and not having enough homes, particularly in high productivity labor markets, has really held back productivity for individual households, for businesses, and for the country as a whole. If any of you have had a chance to read Yoni Applebaum's book, Stuck, that came out last year, he talks about the decline in overall mobility in the US. We used to be a country where people would move to where the well-paying jobs are. And so you would move someplace where you could get into a new industry, you could get a promotion, and that movement was really important for individual well-being and mobility, but also for the country's productivity. Now we have places like California, Seattle, Boston that have well-paid jobs, but particularly younger workers can't afford to live there and buy a home. And so people are not able to stay in these high productivity areas because of the high cost of housing. And I'll say this, it's particularly troubling that the impacts are worst on younger households. They're early in their career, their incomes are still lower, they haven't had time to accumulate savings. And we know that this shows up in a lot of ways. Secretary Spelling mentioned that we have young adults who aren't able to move out of their parents' house and get their own place, right? They stay with their parents longer, or they're living with roommates. They delay getting married and having kids because they're not able to afford a place of their own. So this has really long ripple effects for individual households, and communities overall are struggling to have enough workers in a lot of job categories just because of the cost of housing.
Do you think governors are taking note of this, Jenny?
Absolutely. To date, about 30 states, more than half of the states, have passed some state-level pro-supply legislation. And we have seen this, again, in a very bipartisan way and across the country. States as diverse as Texas and Hawaii and Washington State and Massachusetts have all passed statewide laws. This is really exciting for those of us in the research space because we're getting a lot of diversity in the approaches. Texas, for instance, last year passed a first of its kind starter homes law, making it easier to build small detached homes on small lots, really getting back to that entry-level model home that was so common after World War II, but which is basically illegal to build almost everywhere in the US. So they're really making an effort to create entry-level homeownership and make that feasible. Washington State has done a great job with upzoning around their transit stations so that you can build apartments within walking distance of transit, allowing more people to commute by train, allowing more people to live in these very high demand places. And I would point to also Montana is a state that has now required its larger localities to plan proactively for housing growth. So not just saying the people who are here, the houses that are here now is where we're going to stay, but every so often to go back and say, how many people are going to move here? How many jobs are going to be created? Do we have capacity under our zoning to allow for that and keep updating that over time? So I think these are three of the really promising approaches that we're seeing at the state level.
And at the state level, this is all showing up in the data. So if you look at what's happening in terms of rent growth and home price appreciation and sales volume, there's a pretty close to one-to-one mapping between where successful new supply is being brought online and where affordability is improving for people. So there's a couple of really standout marquee markets. If you've been living under a rock, maybe you've missed it, but rents in Austin are down considerably from their peak. This has been a national story, but there's a bunch of other markets that haven't gotten the same attention. In Colorado, the Denver metro's, close behind in terms of rents being down 10, 15% from their peak because so much supply has been brought online, particularly around transit areas. And that's the case of multifamily. In the case of single family and townhouses and other to own structures, same thing, you've got flat to lower prices and improving affordability at a faster rate than in areas where supply has not been expanded at the same level.
Great. So while we're talking about variation in markets, can you talk to us about some of the markets that are so undersupplied?
Yeah, so undersupplied, it's some of the expensive coastal areas. So where Jenny was saying in terms of very high productivity, high wage areas, that's where you should see more supply. And we haven't necessarily seen that. So, pockets like, San Jose, San Diego are some of the standouts. Los Angeles is another one where we should have more supply than we've got, where affordability is acutely challenged. And as a result, we've got an absence of a lot of sales volume and sales growth because people can't afford to purchase there. And just echoing the point from the Stuck book, we've got research that shows that the number of lifetime moves we expect people to make has dropped by about 10% just in the last couple of years.
Jenny, can you talk to us about off-site construction? And I know one of our board members, is Hugh Frater here yet? Hugh will be very interested in this subject and be talking more about it later today. But can you tell us what we've learned about off-site construction and the technology improvements?
Yeah, I think the first point is that off-site construction is actually a really wide range of different housing typologies and technologies. And so people in the industry, may say factory-built housing. That encompasses everything from the traditional manufactured home built under HUD code, where the entire house is built in the factory, put on a chassis, delivered to the site, and put on a foundation there. But as you were saying, Mischa, we also have more of the panelized construction, where you're building essentially the walls with all of the things in it, and then doing the construction of the walls on site. And we're also interested in things like cross-mod, which is a little bit of a hybrid. The house is built within the factory, but then things like porches and garages can be added on site to give it more of the aesthetics of traditional stick-built housing. So we've seen off-site construction in some form or another for many decades now. And there's kind of always been the question, is it going to break open? Is it going to become bigger? There's some economic downsides. If you build something in a factory and you've got to put it on a truck to ship it, the transportation costs become more expensive. So you save money on the construction labor and the time, but then you're adding this transportation. So looking to areas that maybe be able to set up manufacturing facilities closer to the population centers. But I do think we're going to see more interest in these sort of hybrids. The road to housing, which I'm sure we're going to get to in a minute, lifts the chassis requirement for manufactured housing so that you can have more different kinds of structures, and they they look more like traditional housing, the GSEs have also been really paying attention to, can we provide traditional mortgage financing to manufactured housing on a plot of land that is owned? That gets you away from the chattel loans, which are much more expensive for households. So we're seeing a lot of kind of like chipping away at some of the limitations around the outside. I think there's a real potential for some of this to break open to scale, but we've also been waiting for that for quite a long time, and it hasn't really happened yet.
Have either of you seen the development in Austin? These were, I believe they were concrete poured homes. There's a subdivision of about 100 affordable homes in Austin.
Are these the 3D printed ones?
Yes.
I have unfortunately not seen them in person, but I've seen pictures.
Have you seen them?
I haven't seen them in person. I've also seen pictures, but I do think that it raises an interesting point, which is there's a lot of very interesting technology that's out there. But in order to scale it, you also have to, of course, get the labor force right, because all technologies, you've got to have people trained to work with it. So these things are connected. And a lot of the times when you see a neat technology, you say, oh, that's very compelling. But if nobody knows how to work with it, then you've got to build up a pipeline of people so that you can actually get those benefits. And that's going to be different in different parts of the area. So the reason why I sort of echo the point about hybrid production and more localized is that you have to build differently in different parts of the country, and sometimes that knowledge is local, so it still ties back in the labor force, because some areas they build with CMUs, with masonry units for termite or moisture or hurricane reasons. Other places it's stick framing. Some places you've got seismic concerns, so you do still have to customize how you build for different parts of the country, and a lot of that wisdom and knowledge is built up in that local labor force. So in the back of your mind, remember, the neat technology has to be paired with a qualified labor force that knows what they're doing and how to work with it and how to actually get those widespread gains.
And I will say this is another area that I think is ripe for regulatory reform at the state level to encourage manufactured housing to be done at scale. It helps a lot to have a standardized building code, right? And the standardized building code, say, within the state that takes account of weather conditions and soil conditions. But Colorado is one that has, a couple of 100 different building codes. And so builders have to customize their house depending on where they're building it at the city or county level. That takes away your economies of scale. And so I think states looking more at how can we develop a consistent building code for a given climate, for a given typology, and then allow builders to build to that and not have this sort of infinite set of variations would really streamline the process.
To not put a too fine a point on it, if you want just a really fun example of local variation and building codes, you go, what? In Colorado, if you want to frame something over the base slab, you have to do what's called a floating wall. So you have to actually, if you're in a basement, for example, you have to float your walls from your ceiling joists. And you do that by laying a bottom plate, putting a spike through it, and then the wall can float up and down. There's a lot of confused faces in this room. And if you went to a construction tradesperson in, I believe, the other 49 states, nobody would have any idea what you're talking about. But that's how you have to build in Colorado because of the expansive clay soils. So it's one of those things where, and then each county or each city might have different variations of those rules. So you can imagine why that's tricky in terms of scale and in terms of educating people and making sure that you've got a policy framework that allows for navigating that complexity in a simpler way.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, let's talk about the most important topic today, the road home. It's a really exciting day, and your timing, Dennis Shea, is impeccable that you scheduled this summit on the day that the United States Congress is going to pass a housing bill for the first time in a very long time. So, Jenny, let's start with you because you seem to be really excited about this. Talk to us about what's in the road home and how this will if it will make a meaningful impact on the housing supply.
Yeah, I mean, Road to Housing is a big omnibus bill with a lot of provisions, and so it's trying to tackle the federal levers from a couple of different angles. And we've talked a lot about the state and local rules that are blocking housing, but the federal government also has a couple of levers it can push on. One thing that it does is sort of go through federally funded housing, infill housing that's subject to things like NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, streamline the environmental review process, particularly for smaller projects and infill locations regulations. That's just common sense. We should have done that a long time ago, so it's good to see that come through. Removing the chassis requirement for manufactured housing, again, I think is really going to unlock some additional creativity in the manufactured housing industry. And it's also, we're trying a couple of new things with the federal government creating leverage on state and local governments to adopt better policies, more pro-housing policies. And I'm going to be really interested to see how this works because we haven't done something exactly like this before. There's a combination of HUD putting out some best practices and guidelines. That's very helpful, especially for smaller localities that maybe don't have the in-house expertise to redo their zoning and their building code, having some clear guidelines to follow, and then also some financial incentives. So giving top-ups of CDBG, the new innovation fund that incentivize state and local governments not only to develop better policies, but also to build more housing. And if these wind up being implemented well and turn out to be impactful, there's room to scale these up. A lot of them are pilot programs, but I think we're going to be really interested to see if these are good incentives that work well, then we can do more of them.
Do you want to comment on that?
I mean, but again, no notes. I think it's a perfect answer. Jenny knows the space really, really well. The one thing I'll add is it is, something I think DC and policymakers in the country can be proud of, that we are focusing on supply. Other places that have had some of these affordability challenges have just done demand side changes. And you can do things and improve them at the demand side, but if that's all you do, then you probably won't get the actual affordability gains that you get by focusing on supply. So I just think that that's worth commenting on, that it is a success that the debate focused on good economics and tackled it head on.
So we're going to be taking some audience questions, but I don't see them up on the screen yet, Dennis. If somebody can cue them up. But while we're doing that, let's talk about the new Federal Reserve Chairman and what you see in the coming months in terms of interest rates.
So our official forecast for rates, just to jump right to the answer, we're sort of expecting the mid to low sixes by the end of the year. So probably not getting back into the fives like we had in the first quarter. A lot of the discussion about the Fed has focused on, potential, ideological points of view or differences. I tend to think that the data is genuinely confusing, and that's actually the real source of why people are debating the rate path, right? The labor market has been holding up. It's been quite strong. We've also had the lowest hiring rate in 20 years, right? Those are conflicting signals. If you look at inflation, we've had, sticky inflation. We've not hit the core PCE target, but at the same time, shelter has been coming down in terms of inflation because rents have been declining because of all this new supply. So there's a lot of different conflicting signals, and I don't envy the job they're in because it is genuinely hard to figure out exactly how strong or how weak different sectors of the economy are. And, I'm going to watch it, but despite that long-winded answer, I did start with the interest rate forecast. So you do have that. That's our official point of view.
You mentioned that we probably won't be back into the fives, but what will it take to get all those homeowners that are potential homeowners that are sitting on the sidelines?
I think if you're in the fives, you see very, very strong demand and you see a lot of supply unlocked. So when the GSE announcement about purchasing MBS securities, for anybody who followed that, when that happened, that probably did put some downward pressure on yields and get us into the fives. And when that happened, we had sales growth in the plus 5% year over year range in March, right? So the end of the first quarter. So we had a pretty strong March. When rates come back up into the mid sixes, that's when we're still in the 1 to 2% sales growth. A lot of new supply comes online from people selling in that sub 6.
Great. Okay, we have a question here from the audience. And Jenny, I'm going to throw this one to you. Have we solved a housing shortage of this scale before as a nation? And if you look to history, are there lessons to be learned?
So we haven't had a shortage that's nationwide at the scale that we have now, and that has built up over time. But I think the immediate post-World War II period is a good one to look at. We had very strong population growth after World War II, lots of household formation, and people wanting to buy a house and move out from their older unit. We had the full resources of the federal government put behind it. So that was also the expansion of essentially the modern mortgage loan, making it easier for middle-class families who qualified in order to buy loans, including the GI Bill. And it was also a period when localities were very friendly to growth. And so a lot of the kind of inner ring suburbs that we think about today build a lot of these starter homes very quickly. And so I think this combination of sort of local friendliness to growth and federal financing was really helpful. I think the harder question today is that sort of the easy land close into jobs is mostly built up in other structures now, and redevelopment is inherently more complicated than building on greenfields. So we can't exactly copy from the past, but we can certainly look to some ideas.
Great, thank you. Are we going to tee up another question here? Okay. And Mischa, I'm going to throw this one to you. In your perspective, how do disasters impact housing affordability, including insurance?
It's a great question. So the quick answer is higher insurance costs do make things harder to afford. And we have seen that pop up in a lot of markets. So, whether it's fire or hail or hurricanes or tornadoes, any one of these things, or earthquakes, all of these things will drive up costs. But if you are smart about how you build, you can actually manage some of those costs, right? And I think some communities are focusing on that now in terms of new construction, where they're saying, hey, this is a wildfire zone, we're going to build with concrete siding and metal roofs, right? So you reduce the size of insurance claims if a disaster goes through. Same thing with hail, right? You can get hail-rated roofs that don't need to be replaced after a big storm. That's going to overall put downward pressure on it. So they make it worse. It is an acute pressure for people in areas where insurance rates have gone up a lot. But if you are smart about how you build going forward, and with new building technology and new materials, we can bring some of that cost down. So
Colorado, you see a lot of hail. Are those roofs more expensive?
So insurance, don't ask me what my insurance did this year. It went up quite a lot, and because I live in Colorado, and it costs more upfront to install, let's say, a metal roof or a class 4 shingle roof. But if you install that, you can have a roof that lasts 50 years, independent of hailstorms, versus a roof that's going to last 5 or 7 years. So it can be worth it to pay double upfront, get a discount on your insurance, because a lot of insurers will give you a discount if you get a hail-rated roof, and then you don't have to replace it. So it's just about educating people and making sure that the economics of it are very upfront in terms of, hey, this is actually less money, even though it looks like it's more upfront.
Thank you. Okay, Jenny, this one's for you. What role does housing preservation and home repair play in tackling our affordable housing supply crisis?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've been talking a lot about the supply of new housing, which is important to meet growth in population and jobs. But at this point, our nation's housing stock is older than it's ever been before, partly because we're not building enough new homes to keep up with demand. Older housing stock often is less resilient. It was built to different climate standards. It can cost more to maintain and more to operate. And so we do have to think about maintaining some of the older stock. In particular, older homes that are depreciated somewhat tend to be the cheaper housing, naturally occurring affordable housing. If those fall out of disrepair so that they're no longer habitable, then they are falling out of the stock altogether. On the other hand, in some of the expensive places, we see older buildings that are bought and got rehabbed and become more expensive. So there's sort of ways that it can both filter up in the price spectrum and filter down, both of which really leave us with fewer of the affordable homes. I will say this is not an easy thing to fix, because getting subsidies to small landlords and homeowners to do the repairs can be pretty inefficient and pretty difficult to do. But this is going to be important, particularly in places where we have a lot of older homes.
Thanks, Jenny. And our last question here is, if land is considered one of the largest costs and the federal government is the largest landowner, what has been done to partner with the Fed on finding developable land?
It's a really, really interesting question. I believe that there is an active discussion, but I have not been following the parameters of that discussion closely. I do think that you still have to manage that the land has to be in proximity to job sources. So the Fed may own a lot of land, but if that land is not close to a job source, it's not necessarily part of the discussion. But I have not been following the details of it closely. Maybe you've followed it more closely.
Postal Service and Amtrak, two places we'd love to build land because they're often in really good locations and with good transit infrastructure. In the West, a lot of the public lands is sort of outside cities, not necessarily close to where people want to live and not necessarily the easiest to build on.
Okay, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Ron, again, for making this all possible. Thank you to Mischa and Jenny for this wonderful discussion this morning. Thank you.